We think we know the story, don't we? Whispers of the pharaoh's curse, clinging to dusty tombs like cobwebs. Stories of adventurers who dared to disturb a king's slumber and paid a terrible price. We see images of the Book of the Dead, its papyrus brittle with age, and imagine it's some kind of ancient, leather-bound grimoire filled with incantations to reanimate mummies and unleash plagues. It's a fantastic story, the kind that sells movie tickets and makes for a thrilling Halloween costume. But that story, the one about vengeful mummies and booby-trapped pyramids, is mostly our own invention. It's a modern myth projected onto an ancient one. The real story, the one the Egyptians themselves told for 3,000 years, is infinitely stranger, deeper, and more beautifully complex. It's a story not just about death, but about the very architecture of creation, the daily struggle to keep cosmic chaos at bay, and the intricate, sometimes petty, and always relatable lives of the gods who governed it all. So tonight, let's leave the Hollywood curses behind and journey back to the true source, to the very beginning of everything. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, I'd love to see where you're listening from tonight. Go ahead and post your city or country and your local time in the comments. It's always a quiet thrill to see where these stories are landing. Now settle in, let your breathing slow. We have to go back, not just before the first pharaoh or the first pyramid or even the first person, but back to a time before time itself, before light, before sound, before form. Try to imagine it, the state of non-being. There is no up or down, no hot or cold, no yesterday or tomorrow. There is only an endless, silent, dark, and watery abyss. The ancient Egyptians called this primordial ocean none. It wasn't empty, not exactly. It was a place of limitless potential, a sort of cosmic soup containing the dormant seeds of everything that would ever be. It was perfect, inert chaos, a state of absolute zero where nothing had happened yet, but everything could. For an eternity that can't be measured in years, because years didn't exist, there was only none, silent, still, waiting. And then something happened. Not a big bang, not a violent explosion, but an act of pure, silent thought. From within the infinite stillness of none, a consciousness simply awoke. It willed itself into existence. This was Atum. He had no father, no mother. He was the first thought the universe ever had. He was self-created, the ultimate source. In the beginning, he was formless, a spirit drifting alone in the endless dark waters that had been his cradle and his only companion. He was utterly, completely alone in a universe that wasn't even a universe yet. This is one of the great mysteries Egyptologists still ponder. Was Adam always present within Nun, just waiting to awaken, or did Nun itself spontaneously generate him? The texts are poetic, not scientific, and speak of him emerging from the waters as if breaking the surface. This act of creation was not something Adam did, but something he was. His emergence was the first event. With it, time began, a single moment stretching out from the static eternity that came before. From this first moment, a single point of solid reality was needed, a place to stand in the formless expanse. So the first land rose from the waters of Nun, a single primordial mound of earth known as the Benben. You can picture it as the very first island, the dark, fertile soil of the Nile Valley breaking the surface after the annual flood, an image the Egyptians would have seen every single year. This was their cosmological touchstone. Creation wasn't a distant, one-time event. It was a cycle they witnessed annually. On this small mound, this island of existence in an ocean of non-being, Atum finally took form. Now, how exactly did the rest of creation happen? Here, the ancient priests from different cities had slightly different ideas, like different schools of thought trying to explain an event no one witnessed. The most enduring version, the one from the city of Heliopolis, tells a story that is both cosmic and strangely biological. Atum, alone on his mound, knew that one god was not enough to build a universe. He needed help. He needed family. So in an act that some later scribes found a bit coarse, he created his children through a divine act of masturbation. He took his own seed into his mouth, and from it he spat out his son, Shu, and vomited forth his daughter, Tefnut. It's jarring to our modern sensibilities, but to the Egyptians, it was a powerful metaphor for self-creation, generating life from his own essence without a partner. With a great exhalation, a gust of divine breath, Shu, the god of the air, was born, and with him came his sister, Tefnut, the goddess of moisture and mist, the wetness of the air. They were the first pair, the fundamental principles of the atmosphere, and for a time they were lost to their father in the infinite darkness of none that still surrounded their tiny island of reality. The first act of creation had ended with the first crisis. Atum, the All-Father, having brought forth his two children from his own essence, now faced the terror of being alone once more. Shu, the principle of air, and Tefnut, the essence of moisture, had been born into the vast, dark ocean of Nun that still pressed in on all sides of the primordial Benben Mound. In the infinite, featureless gloom, they drifted away from their father and were immediately lost. Imagine the panic of a new parent, a feeling that is apparently so fundamental, it's woven into the fabric of creation itself. Remember that profound, cosmic solitude Atum had endured for eons before he even existed? Now, having tasted companionship, the return to that silence was unbearable. He had created life, only to lose it to the very same darkness from which he had emerged. He called out for them, but sound itself was a new and clumsy thing, easily swallowed by the oppressive emptiness. For a time that felt like another eternity, Atum was left to pace the small patch of earth he had raised, his joy curdled into dread. But Atum was not just a father. He was the source of all divine power. He possessed a tool, an extension of his own being, his eye. This wasn't just an organ for seeing. The eye of Atum was a distinct entity, a vessel of his power, a fiery, searching force that he could detach from himself. It was a concept the Egyptians would return to again and again, this powerful, often feminine, and sometimes violently independent divine eye. So in a desperate act, he sent this lone eye out into the chaotic waters of Nun to search for his lost children. You can picture it as a single, searching beam of light cutting through an endless black ocean. It was the first light the cosmos had ever known, a focused point of will piercing the primordial night. The eye searched and searched, sweeping through the endless potential of the abyss, until at last it found Shu and Tefnut huddled together and guided them back to the Benben mound. The reunion was overwhelming. Atum, who had willed himself into being from sheer thought, was now overcome by an emotion entirely new to him: relief. He embraced his children, and as he held them, his single eye wept tears of pure joy. As these divine tears fell from the eye of the Creator and struck the dark, fertile soil of the Benben, they did not simply soak into the earth. They stirred, and from them sprang forth the first mortals. Men and women. Humanity was not a grand finale to creation, not a carefully planned masterpiece, but an afterthought born from a father's happy tears. It's a beautifully humbling origin story, suggesting that our existence is fundamentally tied to the god's capacity for love and relief. With his family now restored, the real work of ordering the universe could begin. Shu was not just air. He was the principle of life, of space, of the stillness and dryness that allows for existence. Tefnut was not just moisture. She was the principle of order, of cosmic law, the very concept that the Egyptians would later call Ma'at. They were the perfect pair, representing the delicate balance needed for a stable world: dry air and gentle mist, life force and cosmic rule. Together, they embodied the conditions necessary for more life to flourish. And in the fullness of time, in the now safe space their father had created, they did what divine beings do. They came together and produced the next generation of gods, continuing the chain of creation. From their union were born a son, Geb, and a daughter, Nut. And with their birth, the physical stage for the world was finally set, for Geb was destined to be the solid earth beneath their feet, and his sister Nut, the star-filled expanse of the sky above. The universe was still small, just a single mound of earth in a small pocket of air and moisture, but it was growing, and with it, so was the divine family tree, along with all the love, jealousy, and drama that comes with it. The children of air and moisture were, fittingly, earth and sky. Geb was the solid land, the rust-colored soil and rock, the very foundation of the world. His sister, Nut, was the celestial vault, a graceful, arching presence destined to be decorated with the silver of distant stars. Unlike their parents, who were born into a formless, dark void, Geb and Nut were born into a world that contained one another, and their connection was immediate, cosmic, and absolute. They fell into a deep and passionate embrace, limbs intertwined, bodies pressed so closely together that not even a whisper of light could pass between them. The earth and sky were one. While this might sound romantic, it was for the project of creation a complete disaster. Their embrace, while born of love, was suffocating. The world was still a cramped, dark, and barren place. With the sky lying directly upon the earth, there was no room for anything to grow, no space for the winds to blow, and no domain for the humans, those creatures born from Adam's tears, to inhabit. The process of creation had stalled, trapped in the lovers' static, unproductive clinch. It's perhaps the first, and certainly not the last, time a father had to step in and tell his children they needed to give the world a bit of space. The order came down from the Creator, Adam himself, who saw that this new world was going nowhere. The task fell to their father, Shu, the god of the air. It was his nature, his very essence, to be the space between things, and now he was called upon to perform a heartbreaking but cosmically necessary act of separation. Shu, in his quiet, dutiful way, approached his children. He placed his feet firmly upon the reclining body of his son, Geb, and with a breath that was the first gale-force wind, he began to push. He pushed upwards with all his might, his muscles straining with the effort of separating two fundamental elements of the universe who desperately did not want to be parted. Nut cried out, her fingers trying to cling to Geb's earthly form, but Shu's power was absolute. He was the heir, and his purpose was to expand. Slowly, inexorably, he lifted his daughter high above his head, pushing her further and further away from her beloved brother, until his arms were fully extended and she arched gracefully across the heavens. The separation was complete. The world as we know it, a space for life sandwiched between the ground and the sky, was born in that moment of sorrowful division. This image became one of the most essential and enduring in all of Egyptian cosmology, painted on the ceilings of tombs and the inside of sarcophagus lids, a constant reminder of the world's architecture. Geb lies prone, the earth and his body sometimes depicted with green patches of vegetation beginning to sprout now that he has room. He forever gazes up in longing at his lost love. Above him, held aloft by the eternal strength of their father, Shu, arches the magnificent body of Nut. She is the sky, her skin the deep blue of twilight, her body a canvas soon to be spangled with stars and constellations. Her hands and feet touch the distant horizons, defining the boundaries of the known world. She weeps for her separated lover, and her tears fall to the earth as rain, nurturing the very life that their separation now makes possible. Geb, for his part, is said to groan in his sorrow, and his shudders are the cause of earthquakes. They are forever separated, yet forever connected in a cycle of longing and nourishment. And it is in the vast space created by their father's intervention that the next great chapter of the divine story, a drama of kingship, jealousy, and magic, is about to unfold. In the newly created space between the sorrowful earth and the weeping sky, creation could finally continue. But it wouldn't be simple. Nut, the sky goddess, now carried children within her, the next generation of divine power. However, the supreme creator, the sun god Ra, was displeased. He had learned of the secret union between Nut and Geb, and in a fit of anger, he laid a powerful curse upon his granddaughter. She would not be able to give birth on any day in the year. The official calendar at the time had a neat and tidy 360 days, 12 months of 30 days each. Ra's decree was absolute, and Nut was trapped, her children unable to be born, her body aching with the strain of a pregnancy with no ends. The future of the divine line was in jeopardy, stalled once again, this time not by love, but by law. It was here that another god stepped from the background onto the main stage, not with brute force, but with cunning and intellect. This was Thoth, the god of wisdom, the divine scribe with the head of an ibis. Thoth understood laws, both mortal and cosmic, and he knew that Ra's decree, while powerful, was also specific. He couldn't add days to the year, but perhaps he could win some time that existed outside of it. Thoth approached the moon god, Khonsu, a deity known for his love of games of chance, and challenged him to a game of Senet, a popular ancient board game. The stakes were high. Thoth wagered against a fraction of the moon's own light. Game after game they played, under the quiet gaze of the heavens, and game after game The wise Thoth outmaneuvered the moon god. He didn't win all the light, of course. That would have plunged the night into eternal darkness. But he won enough 1/72nd part of the moon's illumination to fashion 5 brand new days. These 5 days, known as the epigomenal days, were considered outside the normal 12 months of the calendar. They belonged to no month. They were Thoth's days, tacked on to the end of the year to bring the total from 360 to 365, a calendrical correction that the Egyptians actually used. Ra's curse was thus cleverly sidestepped. His decree held true for the 360 days of the calendar year, but on these 5 liminal, uncalendared days, Nut was finally free to deliver her children. On the first of these days, she gave birth to Osiris, the eldest, destined for greatness. On the second, Horus the elder. On the third, the formidable and chaotic Set. On the fourth, the magically gifted Isis. And on the 5th and final day, Nephthys. This is where the divine family tree gets a little complicated, as they didn't really have the same taboos we do. Osiris took his sister Isis as his queen, and Set took their other sister, Nephthys, as his wife. As the firstborn son, Osiris was the rightful heir to the throne of the world. He inherited the kingship from his father Geb, becoming the first pharaoh, a god who walked among mortals to rule them directly. And at this point, humanity, those tear-born creatures from the dawn of time, was not having its finest moment. The myths describe them as savages, living in chaos, uncivilized, and even cannibalistic. But Osiris was a different kind of god. He was a teacher, a bringer of order, not through force, but through wisdom. He traveled the length of the Nile Valley, the land of Egypt, and taught the fledgling human race the art of agriculture, showing them how to cultivate wheat and barley. His wife, the brilliant Isis, taught the women how to grind the grain and bake the first bread, how to spin flax and weave linen. Osiris gave them laws to live by, a structure for their society. He taught them to worship the gods, to build shrines, and to live in peace. Under the reign of Osiris and Isis, the world entered a golden age. For the first time, there was justice, abundance, and culture. He was the perfect king, beloved by his people, and his reign transformed the world into a paradise, a reflection of the divine order, or Ma'at, on earth. But a light so brilliant always casts a very dark shadow. Every paradise has a serpent, and every golden age has its ending. While Osiris and Isis were busy cultivating the land and civilizing the hearts of humanity, a deep and bitter resentment was festering in the heart of their brother. This was Set, the lord of the Red Desert lands, the embodiment of the unforgiving wilderness that bordered the fertile black soil of the Nile Valley. He was a god of immense and terrifying power, a force of nature personified. He commanded the violent storms, the scorching desert wind, and the chaotic energy that civilization sought to tame. His appearance was as strange as his nature. He was depicted with the body of a man, but the head of a creature unknown to zoology, with a long, curved snout, tall, squared-off ears, and a forked tail. He was the outsider, the other, the necessary chaos that defined the boundaries of order. While the people and the gods adored Osiris for his gentle wisdom and the predictable bounty he brought, they feared Set. They respected his strength, for it was a strength needed to protect the cosmos, but they did not love him, and Set knew it. He watched his brother's perfect world, a world of neat fields, orderly laws, and cheerful subjects. And he did not see beauty, so he saw weakness. He saw a cage. His jealousy was a slow burning fire, stoked by every hymn sung in Osiris's honor, every festival held to celebrate the harvest. Why should the bringer of predictable grain be revered, while he, the master of the powerful and unpredictable storm, was relegated to the barren wastes? They were brothers, born just 2 days apart on those strange, uncalendared days Thoth had won from the moon, yet their fates seemed worlds apart. For a long time, this was just a state of being, a cosmic tension between the black land and the red land, a balance of opposites. But then an event occurred that pushed Set's simmering resentment into a cold, murderous resolve. The details, like so many ancient tales, are murky, with different versions told over the millennia. The most famous account, written down much later by the Greek historian Plutarch, describes a deeply personal betrayal. Set's wife, their sister Nephthys, was deeply unhappy. Her marriage to the chaotic desert god was barren. Desperate for a child, and perhaps secretly admiring the gentle king, she devised a plan. Disguising herself as her far more famous sister, Isis, she slipped into the bed of an unsuspecting Osiris. From this illicit union, a child was conceived, the jackal-headed god Anubis, who would one day become the lord of embalming. Whether Osiris was an innocent victim of deception or a willing participant is a mystery the texts leave tantalizingly open. But for Set, it did not matter. The discovery of the affair and of the child that was not his was the final, unforgivable humiliation. His wife had sought his brother's bed, and his perfect, righteous brother had not turned her away. In that moment, cosmic jealousy became a personal vendetta. The fundamental opposition of order and chaos was now a simple, ugly story of adultery and revenge. His hatred, once a diffuse, atmospheric pressure, now had a razor-sharp focus. He would not just challenge his brother for the throne, he would remove him from existence entirely. The time for quiet resentment was over. In the harsh silence of his desert kingdom, under the cold light of the stars, Set began to plot the murder of the king of the world, and the end of the golden age was set in motion. Set's plan was a masterpiece of malevolent cunning. He knew he could not simply challenge Osiris in open combat. His brother was too beloved, and a direct assault would surely turn the other gods against him. Chaos must be cloaked in cleverness. So he devised a trap that was as beautiful as it was deadly. He secretly obtained the exact measurements of Osiris's body and commissioned the creation of a magnificent chest, the most exquisite container the world had ever seen. It was fashioned from the finest imported cedar, inlaid with shimmering gold, brilliant blue lapis lazuli, and panels of ivory. It was not merely a box, but a work of art, a treasure fit for the greatest of kings. But inside, it was a coffin, tailored for one occupant and one occupant only. With his trap prepared, Set announced he would be hosting a grand feast, a celebration for all the gods and the nobles of Egypt. The invitation was extended to his brother, the king, who, suspecting nothing, graciously accepted. The night of the party was a spectacle of joy and opulence. Music filled the halls, dancers entertained the guests, and the finest food and wine flowed freely. Set played the part of the generous host to perfection, laughing and making toasts, his dark intentions hidden behind a mask of revelry. Osiris, in his trusting nature, saw only his brother sharing in the prosperity of the kingdom he had built. He was at ease, surrounded by friends and family, completely unaware of the 72 conspirators Set had planted among the guests, all waiting for their cue. Late in the evening, when the guests were merry and unsuspecting, Set commanded the beautiful chest to be brought into the center of the hall. A hush of admiration fell over the crowd. Set announced with a grand theatrical gesture that this unparalleled treasure would be a gift. He would give it to whomever among them fit inside it most perfectly. Party games in the divine realm, it seems, often had significantly higher stakes. One by one, laughing and jostling, the guests took their turn. A noble was too tall, a minor god too broad. Each attempt was met with good-natured laughter. The chest seemed to fit no one. Finally, Set gestured to his brother. "Surely you, my king," he said, his voice dripping with false deference, "should try." Osiris, caught up in the spirit of the game, smiled and agreed. He lay down inside the chase, stretching out his limbs. It was, of course, a perfect fit, as if it had been sculpted around him. He lay there for a moment, admiring the craftsmanship from within, a look of pleasant surprise on his face. That look turned to shock as, in an instant, the heavy lid was slammed shut, plunging him into absolute darkness. Before the other loyal guests could even react, Set's 72 accomplices swarmed the chest, hammering down long nails to pin the lid in place. They then brought forth cauldrons of molten lead, pouring the shimmering liquid metal into every crack and seam, sealing it completely. The sounds of the king's frantic pounding from within grew faint, then stopped altogether. The party's music was replaced by the grim sounds of hammers and the horrified silence of the loyalists. The deed was done. Set, now the undisputed master of the situation, ordered his followers to carry the chest from the palace. They hauled their terrible burden to the banks of the Nile, the great river that was the source of Osiris's life-giving power. In a final act of desecration, they heaved the sealed coffin into the sacred waters. The current caught it, and the box containing the murdered king of the world began its slow, silent journey, drifting north towards the vast, dark expanse of the great green sea. Back in the great hall, the joyous music had been replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. With the rightful king now floating to his doom, Set, the god of chaos, stood victorious. His face, once masked with false cheer, was now a portrait of triumphant ambition. He declared himself the new king of Egypt, and those guests not in on his conspiracy fled into the night, spreading the terrible news like a plague. The golden age had ended not with a bang, but with the slam of a coffin lid. The news traveled swiftly to the palace, to the ears of the queen. When Isis heard what had been done to her husband, her world, and the world itself fractured. Her first reaction was not a political calculation or a cry for vengeance, but a wave of pure, shattering grief. The serene and powerful queen, co-creator of civilization, was undone. In a single, desperate act of mourning, she took a knife and sheared off a lock of her beautiful hair. She tore at her magnificent royal robes, ripping the fine linen to rags. She covered her skin with dust and ashes, taking on the appearance of a wretched beggar. This was not mere theatrics. It was the outward manifestation of a cosmic wound. Her sorrow was so profound that the Nile itself seemed to hesitate in its flow. The crops in the fields felt a sympathetic blight, and a shadow fell over the hearts of the people who had loved their king so dearly. Isis, the goddess of motherhood and magic, was now transformed into the divine widow, the archetype of all who have lost. But beneath the crushing weight of her sorrow, a core of unyielding iron began to form. Isis knew the laws of the cosmos, for she had helped to write them. Without a proper burial, her husband's soul, his Ba and Ka, would be lost forever, unable to navigate the underworld or find his rightful place in the field of reeds. Her grief was not a passive state. It became the fuel for her mission. Her love for Osiris would not allow him to be forgotten. She would find his body, no matter the cost. Disguising her divine radiance, she set out from the palace, a solitary mourning figure wandering the length of the kingdom. She followed the banks of the Nile, her feet bare on the dusty paths, questioning everyone she met. She spoke to gods and mortals alike, her voice hoarse with weeping, asking if anyone had seen the magnificent chest. For months, her search was fruitless, the trail was cold. Then one day, she came upon a group of children playing by the river. In their innocence, they had no reason to lie or be afraid. They told her that yes, they had seen the grand coffin. They pointed her toward the Tannitic branch of the Nile, the one that flowed north and emptied into the vastness of the Great Green, the Mediterranean Sea. With this new lead, Isis's search became an international odyssey. Her tireless quest led her out of the black land of Egypt and into the world of mortals beyond. Following whispers and rumors, she tracked the path of the chest across the sea, finally learning that it had washed ashore in the distant Phoenician city of Byblos. Her husband's body was no longer in their kingdom, but trapped in a foreign land, and she, his queen, would have to venture into the unknown to bring him home. Upon arriving in the grand Phoenician city of Byblos, Isis did not announce herself as a goddess. Her grief was a sacred and private mission, and she remained cloaked in the guise of a humble, world-weary traveler. She made her way to the city's well, the traditional gathering place for the women of the household, and sat down upon the stone curb, her face a mask of sorrow, saying nothing. Soon, the handmaidens of the Queen of Byblos arrived to draw water. Though Isis was in rags, a divine and sorrowful radiance emanated from her. She spoke to the royal servants gently, and with her magical skill, she braided their hair and breathed upon them, imbuing their skin and clothes with the intoxicating otherworldly fragrance of ambrosia and nectar. When the handmaidens returned to the palace, the queen was immediately enchanted by the divine scent that clung to them. She demanded to know its source, and the servants told her of the mysterious, sad woman sitting by the well. Intrigued, the queen summoned Isis to the court. Still hiding her identity, Isis's quiet dignity so impressed the queen that she was appointed as the royal nursemaid to the queen's own infant son. Here, in the heart of a foreign palace, Isis's quest took a strange and secret turn. She grew fond of the mortal child and decided to grant him the gift of immortality. Each night, when the palace was asleep, she would perform a secret ritual. She would bar the doors and build a great fire in the hall, placing the infant prince within the magical, cleansing flames to burn away his mortal frailties. She herself would transform into a swallow, flying and chirping mournfully around the great pillar that stood in the center of the hall. Of course, Such a scene was bound to be misinterpreted. One night, the queen, driven by curiosity or maternal anxiety, crept to the hall and peered inside. Mortal queens, as a rule, do not react well to finding their babies in a bonfire, magical or otherwise. She let out a piercing scream of terror. The shriek broke the spell instantly, shattering the ritual and sealing the prince's fate as a mortal. Angered by the interruption and her purpose thwarted, Isis dropped her disguise. She emerged in her full, terrifying and beautiful divine form, her radiance filling the hall. She explained who she was, the Queen of Egypt, and why she had come, revealing that the great pillar the queen's husband so admired was, in fact, the tomb of her own husband, the murdered god-king Osiris. The story was almost too fantastic to believe. When the chest containing Osiris had washed ashore at Byblos, a sacred tamarisk tree had sprouted on the spot, growing at a miraculous rate, its trunk completely enveloping the coffin. The king of Byblos, seeing the magnificent tree, had it felled, and without knowing its contents, had it installed as the central support pillar of his new palace. Now, humbled and terrified, the king and queen of Byblos ordered the pillar to be carefully cut open. Inside, just as Isis had said, was the beautiful lead-sealed chest. Isis took possession of the coffin and set sail immediately for Egypt. Back in the familiar seclusion of the papyrus swamps of the Nile Delta, she opened the lid. There lay her beloved husband, perfectly preserved. With the help of her grieving sister, Nephthys, who had abandoned Set to join her, Isis performed her greatest magic yet. She transformed into a kite, a bird of prey, and drew the breath of life back into Osiris's body with the beating of her wings. For a brief, magical moment, the dead king revived, just long enough for Isis to draw his seed into her body and conceive an heir. This was the miracle on the Nile banks. From death, life was created. A son, Horus, was now on his way, an avenger conceived to reclaim his father's throne. Having performed a miracle of life from death, Isis knew her work was far from over. Her husband's body was still vulnerable, and her newly conceived son was the living embodiment of a threat to Set's illegitimate rule. With the utmost care, she found the deepest, most secluded thicket in the vast papyrus swamps of the Nile Delta and hid the ornate chest, hoping the labyrinthine marshes would keep it safe from prying eyes. Her focus now shifted to her own survival and the protection of the divine air growing within her. But the tenuous peace she had secured was not destined to last. Set, ruling from his stolen throne, was a king consumed by paranoia. His reign was one of strength and fear, not love, and he knew his grasp on power was only as strong as his brother's absence. When whispers reached him that Isis had returned from Byblos and that she had not come back empty-handed, his simmering anxiety boiled over into active fury. He could not allow his brother's body to exist. It was a potent symbol, a potential rallying point for his enemies, and in the hands of a sorceress as powerful as Isis, it was a magical weapon that could be used against him. So the dark god of the desert went hunting. The story goes that he was out one night, chasing a wild boar through the swamps under the stark, white light of a full moon. The chaotic energy of the hunt invigorated him, a welcome relief from the stifling politics of the court. As he crashed through the dense reeds, his eyes caught a glint of something unnatural, something out of place in the wild swamp. It was the shimmer of gold and lapis lazuli. By a terrible stroke of fate, he had stumbled upon the very thing he sought, the hidden chest of Osiris. Any semblance of the calculating, clever plotter from the night of the feast vanished, replaced by a storm of pure, unrestrained rage. This was the fury of a usurper who finds his victory is not absolute, the paranoia of a tyrant who sees threats in every shadow. With a roar that shook the marshes, he tore the lid from the magnificent chest, splintering the fine cedar. There lay his brother, pale and silent, a constant, maddening rebuke to his own authority. It seems that for Set, murder was a dish best served twice. In a frenzy of ultimate desecration, he seized the body of Osiris and with his bare hands tore it apart. He ripped his brother's corpse into 14 pieces, an act of such violence it scarred the cosmic order itself. To an ancient Egyptian, dismemberment was the most profound horror imaginable, for it meant the permanent destruction of the soul, denying any hope of an afterlife. But Set was not finished. To ensure that Osiris could never be made whole, could never be given a proper burial, he took the 14 pieces and scattered them. He hurled them far and wide, up and down the length of the great river, into the heart of Egypt itself. One piece landed here, another washed ashore there. Each of the great districts of the kingdom, the nomes, received a fragment of the dead god. The land was now polluted with the evidence of his crime. This act was rich with terrible symbolism. The 14 pieces corresponded to the 14 days of the waning moon, forever linking Osiris's fate to the monthly cycle of celestial decay. Set had not just killed his brother again. He had torn apart the very fabric of the nation and made the entire land of Egypt an accomplice to his desecration. The challenge for Isis had now grown exponentially. She no longer had to find a single chest, but to reassemble a scattered god from the pieces of a now broken kingdom. Faced with the horrific reality of her husband's dismemberment, Isis could have surrendered to despair. Her mission to restore Osiris had just become a seemingly impossible nationwide search for 14 sacred relics. But the goddess had a more immediate and far more important duty. Deep within her, the heir of Egypt, the divine avenger, was waiting to be born. The grand quest would have to wait. Survival came first. Isis retreated back into the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the Nile Delta, to a mythical island called Chemis that was said to float untethered, forever hidden from those who would seek to do it harm. There, among the towering stalks of papyrus that grew so thick they blotted out the sun, she gave birth to her son, Horus. In that moment, Isis, the grieving widow, was eclipsed by Isis, the fierce mother. All her power, all her magic, all her cunning was now singularly focused on the protection of this one tiny, vulnerable infant. For this was not just any child. This was the rightful king of the world, and his uncle, the murderous usurper, would stop at nothing to see him destroyed. The swamp was both a cradle and a cage. Its labyrinthine waterways and dense thickets offered a refuge that Set's agents could not easily penetrate, but it was also filled with its own dangers. Snakes slithered through the muddy water, scorpions skittered underfoot, and crocodiles watched from the banks with silent, hungry eyes. Isis knew that any of these creatures could be a vessel for Set's malice. Her daily life became a routine of constant vigilance. She would hide the infant Horus in a reed basket, much like another famous child would be hidden centuries later, while she went out in disguise to beg for bread or forage for roots. Every rustle of the reeds, every shadow that passed overhead was a potential threat. The stories of this time are filled with tales of her struggles. In one, she traveled under the protection of 7 minor scorpion gods. Seeking shelter one night, she was turned away by a wealthy, callous woman. In anger, one of the scorpions snuck into the woman's house and stung her son. As the boy lay dying from the venom, the mother's wails of grief filled the night. Isis, whose own child was the target of so much hate, could not bear to see another mother suffer. Taking pity on the woman who had scorned her, she used her powerful magic to draw the poison out, healing the child and teaching a harsh lesson in compassion. This power was tested to its absolute limit one day when she returned to their hiding place to find Horus limp and breathless, his face blue. A scorpion, almost certainly sent by Set, had found him. In a panic, Isis let out a cry of despair that stopped the winds and stilled the very bouquet of the sun god Ra in the sky. She gathered her child in her arms and poured all of her divine energy into a great magical incantation, commanding the poison to obey her and leave her son's body. This spell, a testament to a mother's desperate love and a goddess's ultimate power, was so potent that it became legendary. For thousands of years, Egyptians would carve this very story and the words of the spell onto stone tablets called Sipi of Horus. They believed that by pouring water over the stone and drinking it, they could cure themselves of snake bites and scorpion stings, borrowing the power of Isis from that terrible day in the swamp. Slowly, magically, Horus was saved, his survival a direct defiance of Set's will. Hidden in the marshes, protected by his mother's unmatched magic, and nourished by visiting goddesses, the young hawk god was growing stronger, his destiny waiting for the day he would be old enough to claim it. The years passed in the seclusion of the swamp. The infant that Isis had saved with her desperate magic grew into a formidable young god. His arms were strong, his gaze was as sharp as the hawk he embodied, and his heart burned with a singular purpose: to avenge his father and reclaim his birthright. The time for hiding was over. Accompanied by his powerful mother, Horus emerged from the marshes and traveled to the great celestial court of the gods. There, before the divine tribunal presided over by the great creator god Ra, he threw down his challenge. He formally accused his uncle Set of murder and usurpation and demanded the return of his father's throne. The case was brought before the Ennead, the council of the most powerful gods. Horus's argument was clear, simple, and based on cosmic law. He was the son of the king and therefore the rightful heir. His claim was one of legitimacy, of the continuation of the proper order of Ma'at. Set's defense was equally simple and brutal. He did not deny killing his brother. He simply argued it was irrelevant. He was the strongest, the most experienced, the most capable of ruling. Horus, he sneered, was a weak, sniveling child, still smelling of his mother's milk, unfit to wear the double crown of Egypt. His claim was one of might. Let the strongest god rule. The divine jury was immediately and hopelessly deadlocked. Thoth, the wise scribe, argued passionately for Horus and the rule of law. But Ra, the sun god and head of the pantheon, surprisingly took Set's side. He found Horus to be an impertinent upstart and saw in Set the raw strength needed to protect the cosmic order, the same strength that fought off the serpent of chaos, Apophis, from the solar boat each night. The wheels of divine justice, it turns out, grind exceedingly slow. Unable to reach a verdict, the gods decided the matter would be settled through a series of contests. For 80 long years, the case would drag on, marked by vicious legal squabbles, magical duels, and outright brawls. These tales, known as the contendings of Horus and Set, read less like a sacred text and more like a chaotic family feud. In one of the first contests, the gods proposed a boat race, but with a twist. The boats had to be made of stone. Set, ever the literalist, went to the mountains and carved a massive boat from a single peak. Horus, ever the trickster, built his boat from pine wood, but covered it with a thin layer of plaster painted to look exactly like granite. On the day of the race, the two boats were launched. Set's colossal stone vessel, of course, sank immediately to the bottom of the Nile. As Horus sailed past, laughing, Set's humiliation turned to incandescent rage. He transformed himself into a gigantic hippopotamus, charging through the water and capsizing Horus's boat with his massive jaws. The race descended into a brawl. Isis, watching from the riverbank, could not bear to see her son in danger. She fashioned a magical harpoon and threw it at the hippo, but in her haste, she struck Horus. Withdrawing the spear with a cry of regret, she threw it again, this time hitting Set. But as her brother cried out in pain, a moment of familial pity overcame her, and she magically released him. This act of mercy enraged Horus, who felt betrayed by his mother's wavering loyalty. The contests had just begun, and already they were a messy, complicated affair, driven as much by trickery, rage, and messy family dynamics as by any noble quest for justice. The throne of Egypt would not be won easily. The messy family drama of the gods was about to take a shocking and violent turn. Horus, still dripping wet from the river and seething with a sense of betrayal, turned his rage upon his own mother. How could she, who had sacrificed everything for his survival, show a moment's pity for the monster who had murdered her husband and stolen their kingdom? In a fit of youthful, absolute fury, Horus chased Isis down, and in an act that horrified the celestial court, he drew his copper sword and struck off her head. Decapitating one's mother is generally frowned upon, even in divine legal disputes, and the other gods recoiled in shock. Horus, realizing what he had done, fled in shame, leaving his mother's body behind. But the great mother goddess was not so easily dispatched. The wise god Thoth quickly came to her aid, finding her headless form, and with his unparalleled magic, he healed her, replacing her human head with that of a cow. In this moment, she became fused with the goddess Hathor, the gentle celestial cow goddess, explaining for all time the deep connection between these two powerful female deities. The contests, however, were far from over. The squabbles and magical games had failed to produce a winner, and now the conflict escalated to open war. Horus and Set agreed to a final, decisive battle, not of wits or trickery, but of pure physical force. On a desolate mountaintop, under a sky bruised with the promise of a storm, the two gods met. The ensuing fight was brutal, a clash of order and chaos, of legitimacy and raw power. Horus, the noble hawk, fought with precision and righteous fury. Set, the strange beast of the desert, fought with untamed chaotic violence. During the struggle, Horus gained the upper hand and inflicted a terrible wound upon his uncle, crushing or tearing away Set's testicles. This was a profoundly symbolic act of mutilation, magically sterilizing the god of the barren desert, ensuring that the force of chaos could never again reproduce itself. But the fight was not over. Set, howling in pain and rage, launched a final desperate counterattack. He lunged at Horus, his fingers clawing for his nephew's face. He plunged his thumbs into Horus's left eye, the eye associated with the moon, and tore it from its socket. In his rage, he ripped the delicate orb into 6 pieces and flung them into the darkness. Now both gods were grievously wounded, the battle a bloody stalemate. Once again, it was Thoth who came to the rescue. He searched the darkness and painstakingly recovered the 6 fragments of Horus's lunar eye. As he began to piece them together, he, the master of mathematics, noticed something strange. The fractions represented by the pieces, 1, 2, 1, 4, 1, 8, 1, 16, 132, and 164, only added up to 6364. A tiny fraction was missing. Using his divine magic, Thoth supplied the missing piece, making the eye whole again. This act of magical healing transformed the eye. It was no longer just an organ of sight, but a perfect, whole, and magically potent symbol. It became the Wadjet eye, the whole one. Its restoration mirrored the waxing of the moon after its dark phase, and the story of its mathematical reconstruction made it a powerful symbol of healing, protection, wholeness, and divine knowledge. For the rest of Egyptian history, the image of the Wadjet eye would be one of the most powerful amulets available, painted on sarcophagi to protect the dead and worn by the living to ward off evil. The price of vengeance had been a terrible wound, but its healing provided Horus and all of Egypt with a new and potent weapon against the forces of darkness. 80 years of brutal contests and grievous wounds had passed, and still the divine tribunal remained deadlocked. The throne of Egypt hung in the balance, and it became clear that a simple contest of strength would not suffice. A final, undeniable proof of worthiness was needed. Set, ever the schemer, decided that if he could not best his nephew in a fair fight, he would humiliate him into submission. He approached Horus with a smile, suggesting they put aside their conflict for one night and rest together in his palace to celebrate a truce. Horus, wary but seeing no other path forward, agreed. The plan Set had devised was one of ultimate degradation in the ancient world. He would sexually dominate his nephew, an act that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with power. In the Egyptian view, the submissive partner in such an act was rendered weak and inferior, and Set believed this would be the final, irrefutable proof that Horus was unfit to be king. But Horus had been warned by his ever-watchful mother, Isis. As Set made his move during the night, Horus was ready. He did not fight back, but cleverly cupped his hands and caught Set's seed, preventing it from touching his body. The next morning, he ran to his mother, showing her the proof of his uncle's treachery. Isis did not hesitate. Her counterplan was swift and brilliant. First, she cut off her son's now defiled hands and threw them into the Nile, magically growing him a new, pure pair. Then, she magically coaxed forth some of Horus's own seed and went to Set's garden. There, she carefully spread it over the leaves of Set's favorite food, lettuce. This detail seems bizarre to us, But the tall, phallic Egyptian lettuce was strongly associated with virility and was a food sacred to Set. Believing he had finally triumphed, Set called the divine court back into session. He stood before the gods and declared that Horus was unfit to rule, for he had been dominated and made to play the submissive role. "Let my seed be called forth," Set proclaimed to Thoth, the divine bailiff, "and you will see that it answers from within Horus's body." Thoth called out, but to Set's utter astonishment, the seed's voice answered not from Horus, but from the muddy bottom of the river. Now it was Horus's turn. Thoth called out for the seed of Horus. A stunned silence fell over the hall as a muffled voice answered from inside Set. A moment later, a brilliant golden solar disk, the living seed of Horus, burst forth from Set's own forehead. The gods erupted, some in horror, most in derisive laughter. The humiliation was absolute and undeniable. Set, the hypermasculine god of chaotic strength, had been tricked, made receptive to his nephew, and had given birth to his rival's power. His claim of dominance was not just defeated, it was inverted and made a cosmic joke. This was the final straw. Ra himself, who had long favored Set, could no longer defend him. The 80-year-long case was finally over. The tribunal unanimously declared Horus the rightful heir. He was crowned King of Egypt, the living embodiment of order, and the rightful successor to his father. Set's fate was not destruction. Chaos is, after all, a necessary part of the universe, but a repurposing. Ra took the defeated god into the heavens, giving him a new role as the god of storms and thunder. His immense strength was now put to use, protecting the solar bark on its nightly journey, forever fighting the serpent Apophis. His violent nature was finally given a noble purpose, and the proper order of the world was at long last restored. With Horus finally installed as the king on earth, the divine order that had been shattered by Set's ambition was restored. The world of mortals now had its rightful ruler. But while this epic 80-year drama had been unfolding, a much older and more fundamental struggle was taking place, a battle fought not once for a throne, but every single day for the survival of the entire universe. This was the war waged by the great sun god, Ra. His journey was the clockwork of the cosmos, the source of all life, and it was a journey fraught with eternal peril. Each morning, Ra was reborn on the eastern horizon in the form of Khepri, the scarab beetle, symbolizing new creation. As he rose into the sky, he would take his place on his magnificent solar bark, the Manjet, or the bark of 1,000,000 years. For this was no simple vessel. It was a celestial palace sailing upon the blue ocean of the sky, which the Egyptians called the Watery Way. Ra was its captain, but he did not sail alone. He was accompanied by a retinue of powerful gods who served as his crew. The wise Thoth stood near the prow, plotting the course through the heavens. Ma'at, the goddess of truth and order, was the ship's navigator, ensuring its path was true. Other gods like Horus and Hathor stood as protectors, their combined might ensuring the sun's safe passage. As the Manjet boat sailed majestically across the sky, it brought light, warmth, and life to the world of mortals below. The passing of a day was the slow, steady progress of this divine procession. But every journey must have its end, and at dusk, Ra's greatest challenge began. As the sun set on the western horizon, Ra did not die. Instead, he sailed into the underworld, the Duat, a terrifying and chaotic realm of 12 hours or 12 gates. Here, he transferred to his night vessel, the Mesektet bark, and his form changed. He became the ram-headed Aufra, the aged, dying son, a funerary god whose journey now was not for the living, but for the dead. His passage through the Duat brought a fleeting moment of light and consciousness to the souls of the blessed dead, allowing them to live again for a short time before he passed on. But the underworld was also home to his greatest enemy, a creature of absolute darkness and non-existence, the great serpent, Apophis. Apophis was a colossal snake, a being of pure chaos, born from the primordial waters of Nun. His sole purpose was to swallow the sun and his bark, to unmake creation and return the universe to the inert darkness from which it had sprung. Every single night, in the deepest, darkest hour of the Duat, Apophis would attack. The journey would come to a screeching halt as the serpent's colossal coils churned the waters of the underworld. All the gods on the bark had to fight. They cast spells, threw spears, and used their divine power to beat back the monster. And it was here that the disgraced god set found his ultimate purpose. It seems the best way to manage a god of chaos is to give him a job where his violent tendencies are a feature, not a bug. Standing at the very prow of the night boat, Set, the god of storms, was the only one with the raw, chaotic power to match Apophis. With his spear and the roar of a thunderstorm, he would fight off the great serpent, wounding him just enough to allow the bark to pass. Every night was the same desperate struggle, and every dawn was a sign that Set and the gods had won, that order had triumphed over chaos for one more day. The sunrise was never a guarantee, it was a victory. While the raw, chaotic strength of Set was essential for the nightly defense of the sun, brute force alone could not sustain the cosmos. Every divine operation, from navigating the heavens to judging the dead, required a mind of unparalleled intellect and wisdom. And on the solar bark, just as in the celestial court, that role belonged to Thoth. In a pantheon filled with hook-headed warriors, lion-headed destroyers, and crocodile-headed terrors, Thoth was a figure of calm, scholarly authority. He was most often depicted as a man with the head of an ibis, that slender, graceful bird whose long, curved beak reminded the Egyptians of the crescent moon and the graceful curve of a scribe's reed pen. He was the mind of the gods, the divine vizier, the master of knowledge in a universe that was often governed by passion and impulse. His origins are mysterious, with some traditions calling him a son of Ra, and others, from his own cult center at Hermopolis, claiming he was self-created, a being who emerged from the primordial chaos through the power of his own voice. But his function was always clear. He was the divine archivist. In a world run by gods prone to transformations, family feuds, and 80-year-long legal battles, the value of a meticulous note-taker cannot be overstated. It was Thoth, you'll remember, who cleverly gambled with the moon to win the 5 extra days that allowed Nut to give birth to her children. It was Thoth who painstakingly reassembled the shattered eye of Horus, magically completing the missing fraction to make it whole. And when the final, bizarre verdict of the contendings was reached, it was Thoth who stood as the court clerk, impassively recording the judgment for all eternity. He was the serene intellectual who brought order to the messes the other gods made. His greatest gift to both gods and mortals was the invention of writing. He created the sacred system of hieroglyphs, the Medunetter or words of the gods. For the Egyptians, writing was not a mundane tool for bookkeeping. It was an act of profound magic. To know something's true name and to be able to write it down was to hold power over it. A written spell was not a mere description of magic. It was the magic itself, a living formula waiting to be activated by speech. Thoth was the master of this power, the author of the most potent magical texts. Legends whispered of a secret book he had written, the Book of Thoth, which contained spells that could allow a mortal to understand the speech of animals, to see the gods themselves, and even to command the forces of nature. This book was a source of immense temptation and danger, a representation of knowledge so powerful it could shatter the barrier between the human and the divine. As a lunar god, Thoth was also the master of cycles and measurement. He was the one who counted the stars and measured the earth. He established the 365-day calendar, dividing the passage of time into years, months, and days. His steady, waxing, and waning light was a perfect metaphor for the calm, measured accumulation of knowledge. This role extended even beyond the realm of the living. When a soul finally reached the Hall of Two Truths for its final judgment after a long and perilous journey, it would be Thoth who stood beside the great scales. As the heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, Thoth, with his scribe's palette in hand, would watch without bias and record the result, his precise script determining the soul's eternal fate. From the creations of the calendar to the final verdict on a human soul, he was the quiet, unshakable pillar of intellect and integrity that upheld the cosmos. For all the reverence the gods commanded, their relationship with humanity was not always a peaceful one. There came a time, long after the world had been ordered, when the great sun god Ra had grown old. He still ruled as king on earth. His body, though divine, had taken on the frailties of age. His back was bent, his limbs trembled, and saliva dribbled from his mouth. Humanity, the creatures he had accidentally created from his own tears of joy, saw this, and their respect curdled into contempt. They began to mock him, whispering behind his back, and soon these whispers grew into open plots of rebellion. Why, they reasoned, should they be ruled by a doddering old god who had lost his strength? Humanity, it seemed, was entering its rebellious teenage years. Ra, whose divine eye saw all things, was aware of their treachery. He was not just angered, he was deeply hurt. He had nurtured these mortals, and this was their gratitude. He decided to consult the oldest and wisest of the gods. He secretly summoned Shu and Tefnut, Geb and Nut, and even the ancient watery nun from whose abyss he had first emerged. He laid the problem before them. What should be done with a creation that had turned against its creator? It was Nun, the primordial father, who spoke first. He advised Ra not to abandon his creation, but to punish it. He urged Ra to turn the full, fiery power of his divine eye upon the treacherous mortals and remind them what true power looked like. The council agreed. Ra consented and called forth his eye, that same independent entity of divine power he had once sent to find his lost children. But this time, it would not be a searchlight. It would be an executioner. The eye descended to earth and took on a form of terrifying fury, the lioness goddess Sekhmet. She was a being of pure, unadulterated rage. her breath the hot desert wind, her presence a harbinger of plague and death. She was the violent, vengeful aspect of the goddess Hathor, a living weapon of divine retribution. Sekhmet fell upon the plotting humans with a ferocity that stunned the heavens. She tore through their ranks, her claws ripping flesh, her jaws crushing bone. The slaughter was immense. She waded in blood, her lion's mane matted with it, and she found that she had a taste for it. The punishment quickly spiraled out of control. Her initial mission, to quell a rebellion, had become a mindless, bloodthirsty rampage. She was no longer distinguishing between the guilty and the innocent. She was simply killing, determined to wipe humanity from the face of the earth. Looking down from the heavens, Ra and the other gods were horrified. They had wanted a lesson, not an apocalypse. But Sekhmet was lost in her bloodlust, deaf to their calls. Realizing they could not stop her by force, Ra conceived of a brilliant and subtle plan. He summoned his swiftest messengers and ordered them to gather a truly colossal amount of beer from all over Egypt. He then had the priests grind up great quantities of red ochre, a mineral dye, and mix it into the brew, staining it a deep, convincing blood red. That night, under the cover of darkness, thousands of jars of this blood-colored beer were poured out across the fields where Sekhmet was expected to continue her massacre the next day. As the sun rose, the lioness goddess awoke, ready to kill again. She saw the fields, seemingly flooded with the blood of her victims from the day before. Delighted, she stooped down to drink. She drank and drank, the intoxicating brew far more plentiful than any real blood could be. The alcohol quickly took its effect. The ferocious goddess became drowsy, her rage was quenched, and she fell into a deep, drunken slumber. When she finally awoke, the bloodlust had passed. Her fury was gone, and she was transformed back into the gentle, loving Hathor. Humanity was saved not by a great battle, but by a divine trick and a monumental hangover. While the gods fought their cosmic battles and played out their family dramas, every human living along the Nile, from the mightiest pharaoh to the humblest farmer, knew they would one day face a perilous journey of their own. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not an ending, but a transition, the beginning of a dangerous and complicated odyssey that the soul had to navigate to reach paradise. Their concept of the soul was far more complex than our own. They believed it was made of many parts, but two were essential for the afterlife. The first was the Ka, a person's spiritual double or life force, which remained in the tomb and needed offerings of food and drink to survive. The second was the Ba, the individual's unique personality, depicted as a human-headed bird that could fly free from the body after death. It was the Ba that undertook the great journey. At the moment of death, the Ba would separate from the physical body. It would linger for a time, watching its own mummification rituals before turning towards the west. As the sun god Ra began his nightly descent into the underworld, the Ba of the deceased would join him, stepping aboard the solar bark to begin its own passage through the terrifying realm of the Duat. This was the Egyptian underworld, and it was not a simple place of punishment. It was a complex, parallel reality, a landscape of immense danger and bizarre challenges. The Duat was divided into 12 regions, corresponding to the 12 hours of the night, and each was a domain with its own demonic gatekeepers, lakes of fire, and monstrous serpents. To make it through this treacherous landscape, the soul needed a guide. This was the true purpose of the scrolls we call the Book of the Dead. The ancient Egyptians knew it as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, and it was not a book of evil curses, but an indispensable travel guide for the afterlife. It was a personalized collection of spells, hymns, passwords, and instructions, a cheat sheet that would allow the soul to overcome every obstacle. Navigating the afterlife, for the ancient Egyptians, required less in the way of a virtuous life and more in the way of very thorough exam preparation. As the solar bark sailed through the dark hours, the soul would have to face the guardian of each of the 12 gates. These were terrifying entities, gods with the heads of crocodiles or knives for faces. To pass, the soul had to know the guardian's secret name and recite the correct spell from their papyrus scroll. Knowing a being's name gave one power over it, and with the right incantation, the fearsome demon would be pacified and the gates would swing open. Failure was unthinkable. To fail a test was to be cast into the darkness, to be devoured by a soul-eating monster, and to cease to exist entirely, the ultimate horror for an Egyptian. The journey was a relentless series of these high-stakes tests. The soul had to help the gods fight off serpents, convince demonic ferrymen to grant them passage across fiery rivers, and prove their worthiness time and time again. For 12 terrifying hours, the Ba would travel through the darkness, clinging to the protective light of Ra's bark and the secret knowledge buried with it, all in the hopes of reaching the final destination, the Hall of Two Truths, where the ultimate judgment and the fate of their eternal soul awaited. Having survived the 12 gates and the terrors of the night, the soul of the deceased finally arrived at the threshold of eternity, the Hall of Two Truths. This was the celestial courtroom where their entire life would be weighed and measured. The hall was a vast, silent, and awe-inspiring chamber, at the far end of which sat the great god Osiris, now in his ultimate role as king of the underworld and lord of the dead. He presided over a tribunal of 42 fearsome assessor gods, each one representing a district of Egypt and a specific type of sin. The soul, now standing alone before this divine jury, had to perform its most important speech, the negative confession. This was not a plea for forgiveness, but a declaration of purity. Addressing each of the 42 gods by their specific, secret name, the soul had to declare its innocence of a long list of transgressions. "Hail, you who see all," the soul would begin. "I have not committed sin. I have not stolen. I have not made anyone weep. I have not been deceitful. I have not raised my voice. I have not been deaf to words of truth, and I have not polluted the water." It was a comprehensive moral inventory, a final testament to a life lived in accordance with Ma'at, the principle of order and truth. This is why the heart, the Ib, was so important. The Egyptians believed it was the seat of a person's intelligence, memory, and conscience, and after death, it could even testify against its owner. It was the one organ the embalmers always left carefully in place within the mummy. After the confession was made, the final test began. In the center of the hall stood a great golden scale, the instrument of ultimate justice. The jackal-headed god Anubis, who had presided over the deceased's mummification, now stepped forward to act as the master of the ceremony. On one of the scale's golden pans, he placed the heart of the deceased. On the other, he placed a single, pure white ostrich feather, the symbol of the goddess Maat. The entire cosmos seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment, the weighing of the heart. Beside the scales stood two figures. The first was our old friend Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods, his palette ready to impartially record the final verdict. The other was a creature of absolute terror, the monster Ammit, the devourer of the dead. She was a nightmarish chimera with the head of a crocodile, the powerful forelimbs and torso of a lion, and the massive hindquarters of a hippopotamus. She was the divine executioner, and she waited, hungry and patient, for the scale to render its judgment. The tension was unbearable. If the heart was heavy, weighed down by a lifetime of sin, lies, and selfishness, it would tip the scale, outweighing the delicate feather of truth. In that moment, Thoth would record the soul's condemnation. Anubis would step back, and the monster Ammit would lunge forward, devouring the heavy heart in a single gulp. This was the second death, the ultimate end, not hell, but pure, absolute oblivion. But if the deceased had lived a good and balanced life, if they had spoken the truth and acted with kindness, their heart would be light, free from the burden of wrongdoing. It would balance perfectly against the feather. The scale would hold steady. Thoth would record the justification, and Osiris, from his throne, would smile and welcome the triumphant soul into paradise. The scale balances. The heart, light and unburdened, is a perfect match for the feather of truth. A quiet ripple of approval passes through the 42 assessor gods. The monstrous Ammit lets out a disappointed growl and slinks back into the shadows, her hunger unfulfilled for now. Thoth, the divine scribe, dips his reed pen into his palette and records the soul's justification, declaring them Ma Keru, true of voice. The trial is over. The soul has been found worthy. Osiris, the merciful king of the dead, gives a solemn nod of welcome. The justified soul is now formally an Ak, a transfigured and effective spirit, its Ba and Ka finally reunited, ready to enter eternal paradise. Horus himself, son of the king, often appears at this moment to take the soul by the hand and lead them from the solemnity of the court into the light of their reward. This was the field of reeds, or Aru, the Egyptian heaven, but it was not a place of disembodied spirits floating on clouds. The Egyptians were a practical people who loved their life and their land, and their vision of paradise was a perfect, idealized reflection of the world they knew. Aru was the Nile Valley, but without any of its sorrows or hardships. It was a land of eternal springtime, where the sun always shone warmly, the breezes were always gentle, and the waters of the heavenly Nile were always at the perfect height for a bountiful harvest. The canals were teeming with fish, the sycamore trees were perpetually heavy with sweet fruit, and the reeds along the riverbanks grew impossibly tall and lush. Here, the justified soul was granted a plot of land, their own personal estate in eternity. Life in Aru was, in many ways, a continuation of the best of life on earth. The soul could meet and embrace family and friends who had passed the judgment before them. They could spend their days sailing in the gentle currents of the celestial river, playing the beloved board game Sonnet under the shade of a fig tree, or simply enjoying the perfect peace of a world without pain, sickness, or decay. There was, however, one small catch. Even in paradise, it seems, there were chores. The gods expected the inhabitants of Aru to help maintain this perfect landscape, which included plowing, sowing, and reaping the fields. But the Egyptians, ever pragmatic, had invented a magical loophole to get out of doing them. Buried in the tomb with the mummy were small, mummiform statues, sometimes hundreds of them, called shabdes. Each of these figurines was a magical servant, inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead. When the soul was called upon in Aru to perform any manual labor, all they had to do was recite the spell, and the little statue would come to life, answer, "Here I am," and go off to do the work in their place. This freed the soul to enjoy the endless pleasures of Aru without interruption. It was the ultimate retirement, a perfect, peaceful, and work-free existence in a divinely beautiful version of the home they had always loved, an eternal reward for a life lived in balance and a heart as light as a feather. The soul's safe arrival in the field of reeds was not a matter of luck, nor was it based solely on the merits of a virtuous life. It was a victory made possible by the most important possession a dead Egyptian could own, a document of powerful secret knowledge. We have come to call it the Book of the Dead, a name that conjures images of forbidden tomes and sinister curses. But this is a modern fiction. The Egyptians knew it by a much more hopeful and descriptive name, the Book of Coming Forth by Day. Its purpose was not to raise mummies or curse the living, but to grant eternal life to the dead. The spells within were designed to allow the soul to leave the dark tomb and come forth into the daylight to enjoy the sun and to provide the knowledge needed to navigate the dark underworld by night. It was a magical passport, an instruction manual for eternity. This book was not a book in our sense, but a long papyrus scroll, often beautifully illustrated with colorful pictures or vignettes showing the soul's journey. The quality could vary enormously. A pharaoh would be buried with a magnificent, custom-made scroll written by the finest scribes, a true work of art. A lesser noble might have a pre-written, mass-produced version with blank spaces where their own name would be filled in. And a poor farmer might have to make do with just a few essential spells inscribed on their coffin or on a single shard of pottery. The knowledge was what mattered, not the luxury of its presentation. The scroll contained up to 200 distinct chapters, or spells, each with a specific purpose for a specific challenge the soul would face. We have already encountered some of the most important ones. Spell 125, for instance, contained the lengthy negative confession, the script the soul had to recite perfectly before the 42 assessor gods. Spell 6 was the magical activation code for the Shabtai figurines, the spell that allowed the deceased to delegate all their eternal chores. Other spells were designed for self-preservation and power. There was a whole category of transformation spells, which would allow the soul's ba to change its shape at will. Spell 83 would let them become a phoenix, a symbol of rebirth. Spell 86 would let them become a swallow, able to fly swiftly through the heavens. This gave the soul freedom and mobility in the afterlife. Perhaps one of the most crucial and wonderfully pragmatic spells was spell 30b. This was the spell for not letting a deceased's heart create opposition against him. This incantation was often carved into a beautiful green scarab amulet that was placed directly over the heart of the mummy during the wrapping ceremony. It was a direct appeal to the soul's own heart, pleading with it not to bear witness to any sins during the great weighing ceremony. It was a uniquely Egyptian form of afterlife insurance, a magical gag order placed on one's own conscience, just in case. What this all reveals is a universe governed not by faith, but by a kind of magical legalism. The Duat was a dangerous bureaucracy, and the Book of the Dead was the soul's perfectly prepared paperwork, guaranteeing safe passage through every checkpoint on the long journey home. The journey to the field of reeds was the ultimate goal for every individual Egyptian soul. But maintaining the cosmic balance, the Ma'at, that made this journey and all of civilized life possible was the sacred and heavy duty of one person above all others, the king. The pharaoh of Egypt was not merely a ruler, a general, or a chief administrator. He was the central pillar upon which the entire world rested, a unique being who stood with one foot in the mortal realm and one in the divine. He was the sole intermediary, the essential bridge between humanity and the gods. This was because the king was understood to be a god on earth. This was not just a metaphor for his great power. It was a literal, theological truth. The office of the kingship was divine, and the man who held it became the vessel for that divinity. While he lived and reigned, the pharaoh was the physical incarnation of the god Horus. Remember the epic 80-year struggle that Horus waged to claim his father's throne from the usurper Set? That victory was not just a one-time event. It was the mythological charter for all Egyptian kings. Every pharaoh who took the throne was the next Horus, the legitimate heir, the defeater of chaos, and the establisher of divine order on earth. One of his most important royal titles was his Horus name, identifying him as the living successor of the great hawk god. This divine connection didn't stop there. The king was also called the son of Ra, a title that linked him directly to the supreme creator god. This meant he was not only the heir to the earthly throne of Osiris, but also the chosen representative of the master of the universe. It was his job to oversee the rituals and maintain the temples that ensured the sun would continue to rise, that Ra would defeat Apophis each night, and that creation would endure. When the pharaoh eventually died, his divinity was not extinguished. It was transformed. The dead king became Osiris, merging with the great god of the dead to rule over the underworld. The moment he died, his heir, the crown prince, instantly became the new Horus, son of the new Osiris. This seamless divine cycle of succession, Horus becoming king, the king dying and becoming Osiris, and a new Horus taking his place, was the ultimate source of Egypt's stability. It meant that the kingship itself was immortal, even if the king was not. Being the living embodiment of a god came with a considerable amount of pressure. The pharaoh was the chief priest of every god in every temple throughout the land. Though in practice local priests carried out the daily rites, they did so only as the king's proxy. It was his personal responsibility to maintain Ma'at by performing the most sacred rituals, by upholding the law which was seen as a reflection of divine will, and by defending the borders of Egypt from its enemies. Foreign invaders, particularly those from the chaotic desert lands, were seen as the agents of Set. Every military campaign was thus a ritual reenactment of the victory of Horus, a necessary suppression of chaos to protect the sacred, orderly land of Egypt. For 3,000 years, this ideology of the divine king was the unshakable foundation of their civilization, turning a foundational myth into the operating system for a nation. The divine pharaoh performed his sacred rituals to uphold Ma'at, and the justified soul chanted its spells to navigate the Duat. But the power that made those rituals and spells actually work, the fundamental energy that flowed through all of creation and made the impossible possible, had a name of its own. It was called Heka. For the Egyptians, magic was not a violation of the natural order. It was the very force that powered it. Heka was the Egyptian equivalent of physics, the operating system of the cosmos, and it was so fundamental that it was also personified as a god. The god Heka was said to have been created by Atum at the very beginning, the active force that allowed the creator's thoughts and words to manifest into the physical universe. Magic wasn't a later addition to the world. It was a cornerstone of its initial construction. Heka itself was a neutral force, a tool that could be wielded for creation or destruction. In the hands of a goddess like Isis, it could be used to heal a poisoned child or even briefly revive the dead. In the hands of a wise god like Thoth, it could reassemble a shattered eye or create new days for the calendar. But this same power could be used by a bitter sorcerer to curse a rival or bring misfortune to an enemy. The Egyptians understood that this power was simply there, woven into the fabric of reality, available to anyone who had the secret knowledge of how to access and direct it. This knowledge was based on a few core principles. The first was the power of the name. To know the true, secret name of a person, a demon, or even a god was to have a measure of control over them. This is why the spells in the Book of the Dead so often involved naming the terrifying guardians of the underworld gates. The second principle was the power of the image. The Egyptians believed that an image, whether a statue, a carving, or a drawing, contained a portion of the essence of what it represented. This is why spells could be cast upon wax figurines of enemies to cause them harm, and why statues of gods were believed to be actual manifestations of that god, capable of hearing prayers. The third, and perhaps most important principle, was the power of the spoken and written word. The hieroglyphs themselves were magical. Reciting a sacred text was not just reading. It was an act of creation, making the words real. This belief system infused every aspect of Egyptian life. Magic was not just for epic, mythological events. It was a practical tool for daily living. Amulets in the shape of the Wadjet eye were worn to ward off evil spirits. A doctor setting a broken bone would recite a magical incantation over the patient to speed the healing, seeing no contradiction between the physical and magical remedies. Lector priests, who could read the sacred texts, were revered as powerful magicians capable of interpreting dreams, healing the sick, and protecting the community. From the grandest temple ritual designed to keep the sun in the sky, to a simple love charm carried by a young woman, it was all Heka. It was the energy that animated the universe, a divine power that the gods, and with the right knowledge, even mortals could learn to command. This cosmic energy, Heka, was not left to drift aimlessly across the landscape. It was carefully cultivated concentrated, and communed with in special places that served as intersections between the mortal and divine realms. These were the great temples that lined the banks of the Nile. An Egyptian temple was not primarily a place for the public to gather and worship. It was quite literally the house of the god, and its design was a perfect model of the universe itself. The massive outer walls separated the sacred, orderly space within from the chaos of the outside world. The temple floor rose gradually as you moved deeper inside, representing the primordial Benben mound rising from the waters of creation. The great columns of the halls were carved to look like papyrus and lotus plants, symbolizing the first life that grew on that mound. And the ceiling was painted a deep blue and spangled with golden stars, representing the sky goddess Nut. To walk into a temple was to walk into a miniature, perfectly ordered cosmos. Deep within this stone universe, in the smallest, darkest, most sacred room called the sanctuary, stood the cult statue of the god. This was no mere idol. It was a physical vessel which the Ka, or the divine spirit, of the god could inhabit, making the god physically present on earth. The daily life of this statue was in many ways more pampered than that of the king himself. Every morning at dawn, the high priests, acting as the pharaoh's representatives, would break the clay seal on the sanctuary doors and enter the holy chamber. They would awaken the god with hymns, ritually wash the statue, and dress it in fine linen and precious jewelry. They would then present it with a feast of bread, meat, beer, and wine, burning incense to create a pleasing aroma. The god, it was believed, would magically consume the spiritual essence of the food, and the physical leftovers would then be taken and eaten by the priests. This intimate, sacred ritual was repeated every day, a vital piece of cosmic maintenance to keep the god happy and benevolent, thus ensuring the continued stability of the world. Since common people were never allowed into the sacred heart of the temple, their only chance to interact with their god was during a great festival. On these special occasions, the cult statue would be placed within a gilded, boat-shaped shrine called a sacred bark. Hoisted onto the shoulders of the priests, the god would emerge from the temple into the brilliant sunlight and the roar of the waiting crowds. This procession was a time of immense celebration. The people could see their god, shout prayers and petitions, and receive blessings. It was a joyous, chaotic, and necessary disruption of the usual order, a moment when the barrier between heaven and earth became wonderfully thin. This belief in the divine inhabiting the physical world extended beyond statues. The Egyptians also believed that the Bai, or personality of a god, could manifest on earth in the form of a specific sacred animal. The most famous of these was the Apis bull of Memphis, a specific living black bull identified by priests according to 29 distinct sacred markings, was believed to be the living incarnation of the god Ptah. This bull lived in a temple, was pampered by priests, and used as an oracle. When it died, all of Egypt went into mourning, and it was mummified and buried with the same pomp and ceremony as a king. Likewise, cats were sacred to the goddess Bastet, crocodiles to the fearsome Sobek, and the intelligent ibis was sacred to Thoth. These were not just animals, they were living, breathing windows into the divine. For nearly 2,000 years, the sprawling, complex, and deeply comforting system of gods, temples, and rituals formed the unshakable bedrock of Egyptian life. The names of the gods might shift in prominence, and new deities might be introduced, but the fundamental polytheistic structure of the cosmos was never in doubt. Then, in the 14th century BCE, at the height of the new kingdom's power and glory, a pharaoh came to the throne with a vision so radical, so revolutionary, it threatened to shatter that bedrock forever. His name at birth was Amenhotep IV, but the world would come to know him as Akhenaten, the heretic king. He began his reign conventionally enough, but it soon became clear he had a unique and obsessive religious focus. He directed his worship towards a single specific aspect of the sun god, the Aten, the physical, visible disk of the sun in the sky. At first, this was not so strange. Pharaohs often had a patron deity, but Akhenaten's devotion went further. A few years into his reign, he made a declaration that sent a seismic shockwave through the entire nation. He claimed that the Aten was not just the greatest god, but the only god. Every other deity in the sprawling Egyptian pantheon, the great Amun-Ra, the beloved Osiris, the magical Isis, the wise Thoth, was a fiction. Their stories were lies, their temples were houses of falsehood, and their priests were charlatans. To symbolize this complete break with millennia of tradition, the king changed his own name from Amenhotep, which meant Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. He then abandoned the great religious capital of Thebes, the heart of the cult of the now outlawed Amun-Ra, and built a brand new, custom-made capital city from scratch on a desolate stretch of desert. He called it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. Here, he and his queen, the beautiful Nefertiti, would preside over their new world order. The changes were total and absolute. The old temples with their dark, secret sanctuaries were closed, and their vast revenues were diverted to the Aten cult. The new temples built in Akhetaten were open-air courtyards with no roof to block the direct life-giving rays of the sun. The very concept of the afterlife was rewritten. The entire elaborate journey through the Duat, the judgment before Osiris, the paradise of the field of reeds, all of it was discarded. For Akhenaten, the only afterlife was to have your spirit continue to witness the rising of the Aten each day. Art, too, was transformed. The serene, idealized, and eternally youthful figures of traditional art were replaced by a strange and startlingly intimate naturalism. Akhenaten and his family were depicted with elongated skulls, spindly limbs, and soft, protruding bellies, a style so unique it is instantly recognizable. Historians still debate the king's motives. Was he a true monotheistic visionary, the first in human history? Was this a shrewd political move to break the immense wealth and power of the priests of Amun-Ra? Or was he a strange, isolated fanatic? Whatever the cause, his revolution, imposed from the top down, did not last. When Akhenaten died after 17 years of his radical experiment, his new religion, which had never truly captured the hearts of the common people, died with him. The death of the heretic King Akhenaten was the death of his strange, singular vision. The revolution, which had been held in place only by the force of his will, collapsed almost overnight. The great city of Akhetaten was abandoned, its open-air temples left to the desert wind, its memory systematically erased by his successors. The young boy king, Tutankhaten, was brought to the throne. and his first and most important act was to signal the return to the old ways. He changed his name to Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, reopened the grand temples at Thebes, and restored the vast pantheon of gods to their rightful place. The priests returned to their sanctuaries, the daily rituals resumed, and the familiar comforting stories of Osiris and Isis were once again told. The great heresy was over. But while the traditional faith was restored, Egypt itself was beginning a long, slow transformation. The height of its imperial power had passed, and for the next 1,000 years, it was ruled by a succession of foreign powers, Libyans, Persians, and finally the Greeks under Alexander the Great. Yet the gods of Egypt endured. The new Greek rulers, the Ptolemies, did not destroy the old faith. Instead, they merged it with their own. In the bustling new capital of Alexandria, hybrid gods were born. The great Osiris was blended with the sacred Apis bull and Greek gods like Zeus and Hades to create a new international deity named Serapis. The wise Thoth was identified with the Greek Hermes. The ancient gods, ever pragmatic, were not above a bit of rebranding to stay relevant in a changing world. But the one deity whose cult not only survived but thrived was Isis. Her story of the devoted wife, the grieving widow, the fierce mother, and the master of all magic resonated deeply throughout the Greco-Roman world. She became a universal goddess of salvation and compassion, identified with nearly every major female deity from Greece to Babylon. Temples dedicated to her were built in the heart of Rome itself, her mysteries promising comfort and rebirth to all who sought her. Her story was the last great chapter of the Egyptian pantheon, a final, brilliant flourishing before the end. The final silence came not from a conqueror's sword, but from the quiet spread of a new faith. With the rise of Christianity, the old ways were seen as pagan idolatry. In the year 391 AD, the Roman Emperor Theodosius ordered all pagan temples throughout the empire to be permanently closed. The priests were scattered, the rituals ceased, and the divine statues were toppled. The last known hieroglyphic inscription, a prayer scratched onto a wall at the temple of Isis at Philae, was written soon after. Then, the knowledge of how to read the sacred script, the very language of the gods, was lost. For more than 1,400 years, the gods of Egypt slept, their names forgotten, their stories buried under the silence of the sand. But their echoes remain. They are in the enduring awe of the pyramids, the whisper of the wind around the great temples, the potent magic of symbols like the Ankh and the Wajet Eye, and in the timeless human stories of a divine family that taught us about life, death, and the unending struggle to keep the light of order burning against the encroaching darkness. And so, the story ends. The gods are at peace, and now you can be too. Sleep well.